Welcome to this webinar hosted by HeadSpin. And our topic today is Appium 2 and celebrating that it is actually finally released, which is a big deal because it has been a very long road, as any of you who've used Appium will know. I am located in Vancouver in Canada, so it is nighttime for me. Got a little light here to provide some lighting, and I'm guessing that for many of you it might be morning or afternoon or some other time. So a happy time of day appropriate greeting to all of you, and thanks for joining us. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available. So if you have to leave for a meeting in the middle of it or something like that, don't worry. You're all signed up for the webinar already, so we'll make sure to give you access to it afterwards. All right, so let's kick it off. This is me. This is the person who's talking to you now. I'm Jonathan Lips. I work at HeadSpin, helping to ensure that all aspects of automation work well on our cloud service. And primarily my focus is on Appium. I presume you know what Appium is if you're here. I've been the architect and maintainer, lead maintainer of the project since the beginning. Yeah, we've hit a lot of milestones, most recently the release of Appium 2, which was a couple weeks ago now. We're going to talk about some of what the journey to Appium 2 looked like, as well as what Appium 2 is all about, why we decided to shift the number from 1 to 2, which is in many ways sort of a marketing or a vision sort of choice these days, versus some kind of purely software related choice. And so we'll do a bit of a tour of what's new. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have a much better idea about what Appium 2 is and how you can get started with it if you haven't already. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So yes, Appium 2 is now released. And since the very first commit on an Appium 2 feature, it's been almost 4 years. So this has been a pretty long journey. There have been, between betas and release candidates, almost, I guess, exactly 76 different releases along the way. And as many of you might know, for well over a year now, we've been recommending that people only use Appium 2 even while it was in beta, because it was the only version really being supported. And most of the work that we did on Appium 2 in the last year was really kind of internal stuff, things like typing our code so that we could have automatic, or we could have documentation automatically generated from code, and writing better documentation and things like that. So from a user's purely software perspective, Appium 2 has been ready to go for a while. But I will admit that even given that 4 years, almost 4 years, is a pretty long time to be working on a release. It's kind of the way it goes sometimes in the open source world when you're collaborating with a team of people and don't necessarily have a single company or a single boss that is guiding a project, while also trying to maintain the current project and provide support and all that. We have a pretty small team of core developers. It's only about 3 to 5 people, depending on how you count, and then other maintainers of some of the peripheral projects in the ecosystem. So there's not that many of us, and we've been working hard on this release, and it is now out. Part of the benefit of having such a long beta period is that there have been relatively few bugs since the official release. I think I'm only aware of one actual bug in the Appium server that was found since the release, and that was a bug that I found when I was trying to update one of my my Appium 2 plugins. So that's also that's been fixed. Anyway, not to say that it's perfect. Please do continue to report bugs and issues. But we have had a fairly long beta period, which was good. As a bit of trivia, this is the first commit that was made to Appium 2 branch. It actually is a pretty large commit, so this was probably weeks of work for this one merge. But this was the work that added the new driver command line interface that lets you list and install and update drivers, which is a big part of Appium 2 now, because you can find and install drivers from a lot of places, not just the core Appium project anymore. So this was an important first piece to work on. And yeah, that was, if we look at the timestamp here, October 2019. Yes, so even before the days of COVID, we started working on Appium 2. And this little sticker says that the first beta was in almost, I guess not almost a year later, but 3/4 of a year later. All right. So what was Appium 2? What is Appium 2 all about? The vision is pretty simple to express. It's that every software platform should have some kind of WebDriver compatible automation. WebDriver is and has been a great automation language API protocol for the web, and it expresses ways of automating user interfaces that can extend far beyond the web. And Appium proved that out with mobile in the first 10 years of its life, and we felt that there was room to expand that vision even further. But that came with a bunch of new requirements. But this is essentially Appium 2's vision, and this is why Appium 2 involves some of the changes that it does, which I'll go into in more detail. So these are some of our specific goals for Appium 2. We can look at them in terms of the problem that we're trying to address with a particular Appium 2 solution. So one problem that we've noticed over the years, and this goes to our core vision of WebDriver automation for anything, is that there are too many platforms for us as a small team of developers of varying backgrounds can support. There's too many people also that could maybe help with platform support for a new platform, but would find it hard to get started with the Appium code base. So there's kind of multiple dimensions to this problem when we're trying to push into a whole new variety of platform support. So part of our solution here with Appium 2 is to actually take Appium and split it from one thing into several concepts. So before, Appium was just an iOS and Android automation library that had a client server architecture and all these things, but fundamentally it was just you wanted to automate iOS and Android, and you use Appium to do that. And we've turned that into a very strict delineation between the Appium server, which essentially hosts the WebDriver API, and specific platform support, which is facilitated by what we call drivers, right? So we now have an iOS driver, which is called the XUI test driver, or an Android driver. We've got two of those, one called the UI Automator 2 driver, and one which is the Espresso driver. So these drivers have the responsibility of mapping WebDriver API calls to specific automation behaviors on the platforms that they're trying to support. And as the 3 to 5 people on the Appium core team, who I myself my background is in web development and backend development and Node.js development and things like that. I'm not a Tizen TV developer. I'm not a Roku developer. So it's going to be very difficult for me to maintain platform support for those platforms that I don't really know anything about. But there are people out there who do know about those platforms. And we wanted to make it easy for them to take that knowledge of that platform and with the smallest possible amount of code, support a WebDriver style automation for that platform. So we call that the driver ecosystem. And with Appium 2, it's now easy for anybody, not just us, to write and share Appium drivers with the world that anybody can use. In a similar fashion, over the many years of Appium's existence now, we've often faced the problem that somebody has a valid use case for integrating Appium with some other idea, some other service that is valid and good, but maybe not universally useful. And we don't want to clutter the core Appium software with all of these things that are useful for some people but not others, and might even prove a disadvantage for some people that don't want to use them in that way. So Appium 2 also ships with a new plugin system, and plugins are bits of software just like Appium drivers, but instead of providing support for a platform, they kind of have a much broader possibility space that they live in. Basically, they can intercept and re-implement any WebDriver command, any Appium command, and they can also do things to the Appium server like host websites in it or run services on different ports and things like that. So there's really kind of unlimited power that you get with Appium's plugin system, and it makes it easy for anyone out there, not just the Appium maintainers, to write bits of software that make Appium more useful by interacting with other technologies for interesting integrations or building new features into Appium, things like that. So that's something that I'm very excited about, and there's already been a fair bit of development in the Appium plugin ecosystem, and I'll make a list of some of the plugins that exist now that you can already use. And of course, I'm hoping that people get ideas for interesting things they can do with Appium, and instead of coming to the core team and saying, can you build this as a feature, they can just go and build it themselves and then share it with the world. That's kind of a core part of the vision of Appium 2 as well. Another big problem that we had is that the project's documentation was subpar. It contained a lot of outdated information. And more than that, we had a pretty difficult documentation situation in general, because we have all these different platforms that we want to support, and each driver works a little bit differently. And we tried to kind of put all the information about all the drivers into one place, and it just turned into an impossibility to maintain all of that. And so with Appium 2, we've decided that the responsibility for documentation for a particular platform belongs to the driver. So the iOS driver should be the one that hosts all the documentation about how to use Appium for iOS, because that's the responsibility of that driver. That's where that knowledge lives, and so that's the closest place to the code to keep that documentation. But then, with that, we run into a problem of how do we make it easy for driver authors and plugin authors who might not be part of the Appium core team? How do we make it easy for them to write documentation? And so we actually created a whole new documentation generation framework. So anyone who writes an Appium driver or plugin has access to this framework and can have documentation automatically generated from their code to provide a nice reference for users, as well as be able to host a nice website. And I'll give you an example of what the Appium documentation websites look like. So this is also available not just to the core Appium project, but to any project that's building in the Appium ecosystem. So we're very excited about our new documentation environment. and think that, it will, in the long run, be much better maintained, stay much more in link with the reality of the code, and therefore be more useful for everyone that's consuming it. And of course, there was a lot of internal mucking about that we wanted to do with Appium 2, kind of architectural reworking that isn't particularly relevant for you maybe as end users, but was important for us to kind of take care of, to make sure that our software continues to be, easy to maintain and update for the next 10 years of its life. And it's just, if you've worked on any software project that's long lived, you know that it requires constant maintenance and updating. Otherwise, eventually technical debt or just old code can kind of overwhelm a project. So those were the goals for Appium 2. We also had some specific non-goals, because people often asked us, is Appium 2 going to involve X feature on iOS, or is it going to have Y breaking change on Android or something like that? And we very specifically decided that platform-specific updates were not a part of Appium 2. So platform-specific updates continued to happen, obviously, as we developed Appium 2. But that was part of the Appium 2 vision, that specific drivers can continue along their course of development at the pace that's best for them, with breaking changes that are best for them, with new features that are best for them, without needing to have that affect the Appium server itself in any way. So drivers now follow their own development processes and timelines and schedules and all of that, which is a much more sane way of running this ecosystem. And so the new drivers, well, all of the drivers now require you to use Appium 2 if you want to get their updates. But there weren't any breaking changes in those drivers as a part of Appium 2. So Appium 2 is not about doing things to iOS or Android, to put it more clearly, maybe. Okay, let's talk about some of the major new features. We've talked about the driver ecosystem and sort of what it is. I kind of also talked about this point just now, that drivers can now follow independent development trajectories. So new driver releases don't require a new release of the Appium server. Theoretically, as long as Appium 2.0 doesn't have any significant bugs that we need to, release that change the way drivers have to consume Appium, you could continue using Appium 2.0, 5 years from now or whatever, even as hundreds of new releases have happened in the XUI test driver or the UI Automator 2 driver, because those drivers can now evolve independently without needing a new Appium server release to make them available. They're just available directly to anyone using Appium. And also we've made it easy for third-party driver authors, so people writing drivers that aren't the Appium core team, to create their drivers using a minimal amount of Node.js code in many cases. And there's documentation on how to do this, which is part of our new documentation. And to distribute these drivers. We want it to be possible for people to push their driver to NPM and have the whole world use it without needing to go through some kind of centralized authority like the Appium team. So with the plugin ecosystem, we've already talked a little bit about what plugins are, but there's basically no limit to what plugins can do. And so we can just look at some examples of existing plugins to give you an idea of the possibilities out there. Just as with drivers, third parties can create and distribute plugins easily, and other people can download, consume, use them. And also an important fact is that plugins can be mixed and matched. So that was part of the idea. You can't use both the iOS and Android driver at the same time. Like, that doesn't make sense. You're either automating an iOS app or an Android app, not both at the same time. But you could imagine different plugins both being used at the same time. So, a plugin that automatically adds certain capabilities. Could be used at the same time as a plugin that gives you easy access to certain touch actions or something like that. These are unrelated ideas that can be combined in useful ways. It does mean that as a user, you have to be careful that you're not combining plugins which somehow clash with one another. That's a possibility. But the really powerful element of the plugin ecosystem is that you can stack these plugins in ways that are useful to you. So here's a little introduction to how we would get going with Appium 2. If you're already familiar with Appium 1, this should be pretty straightforward. First thing we do is install Appium 2, which is the same as the way we used to install Appium 1. You just use npm to install it. And the simplest way to install it is to install it globally. So it's just a command that's available in your terminal. You just run Appium and it'll start the server for you. One thing that's different from Appium 1 is that we now need to tell Appium what drivers we want to use, because of the maybe hundreds of drivers that exist in the future. We can't bundle them all with Appium. Some of them might not even be known to the Appium core team, right? So you just need to be explicit about which drivers you want to use. You can do that in a couple different ways, but the most common way is to use the Appium driver command line interface. We call it the Appium extension command line interface because drivers and plugins are both Appium extensions, and you can use the same command line interface to install or update or list or delete drivers and plugins. So here's an example of how we would kind of install the basic iOS and Android plugin or drivers, in an Appium 2 world. Next, to start an automation session, you need to use your Appium or Selenium client and start a session with a correct set of capabilities. Capabilities are just parameters to starting an automation session. Importantly, Appium now only accepts W3C WebDriver specification compatible capabilities. This means that any capabilities which aren't explicitly mentioned in the WebDriver spec need to have a prefix. In this case, we've chosen Appium as our prefix, so you can see Appium : device name instead of just device name. So in most cases, your Appium client will do this for you automatically, so it's not even a breaking change for you to switch your tests over. But that is a fact, that we decided to make reality because we wanted to be W3C spec compliant when it came to our WebDriver implementation. If you want, it's totally optional, of course, but you can install some plugins. So I'm showing here how we might install the images plugin, which is the place where you now host, or the plugin which now hosts image element related commands. So finding screen regions by an image template. You can also install plugins from npm. For example, a plugin that some of our plugin maintainers have made on their own, which you can check out. I think I've got a link to later. And there's also a very helpful migration guide. So I'll just show you what it looks like here. It's in our documentation. It's called Migrating from Appium 1.x to Appium 2.x. It's very thorough. So it's got a list of all the breaking changes, most of which don't affect the majority of Appium users, but there are some, of course, some of which we just talked about. And then there's discussions about new features and things like that. So this is kind of your one-stop shop for figuring out what's changed between Appium 1 and 2 and what you might need to do in order to migrate. If you find anything missing in this document, then please let us know. We want this to be as accurate as possible. Okay, another important fact about Appium that's somewhat related to Appium 2 is that we have stopped supporting a piece of software that was in pretty high use called Appium Desktop. Appium Desktop was a graphical way of starting and stopping an Appium server and looking at the Appium log output. With our new Appium 2 ecosystem, because Appium and the drivers and the plugins you're using can be combined in so many hard to define ways using drivers or plugins from third parties and things like this, we decided it wasn't really possible to maintain Appium Desktop moving forward. So right now, the only supported way of running the Appium server is from the command line. But it's not entirely bad news, because the reason most people used Appium Desktop wasn't to run an Appium server, it was to use the inspector to find locators for elements or to drive an application manually, things like that. So that project still exists. It just doesn't have the server component. It's now just called Appium Inspector. It's its own repository, its own project, and it's very well maintained. We've got a lot of people really contributing, features and bug fixes, and it's seen a lot of updates in the last couple of years. A couple new things that you might not have seen unless you're using new versions are a gesture builder or touch action builder, however you want to think about it. Lets you build multi-touch actions in a point and click fashion. So you can create basically any type of gesture that can be expressed with the WebDriver Actions API, which is basically any type of gesture using up to, I think, five pointers and all that. So you can define actions like scrolling or zooming, or zooming in or out, or drawing a circle, or whatever it is, using this gesture builder, and then you can replay those on potentially many different apps. So it's a nice way to save these gestures and reuse them. We also have a new feature that helps you find exactly the element that you're looking for, because one big problem that we realized existed over the years is that many elements overlap entirely. And so with the inspector, just hovering over an element might not be sufficient to find the exact element in the tree that you're looking for. And so we have this new element handles feature. And it's a little bit hard to explain how it works, but it's fairly intuitive when you use it. So I recommend checking that out if you're having trouble with overlapping elements and finding the right one to get the locator selector for it. So a quick tour of some of the new platform drivers that have been released kind of in conjunction with Appium 2, including work by my team and I at HeadSpin. And we've got a new driver for Roku TV applications, Tizen TV applications, LG WebOS TV applications. You can notice a kind of media TV theme there. Also a Chromium driver. So if you want to automate Chrome on your desktop, rather than Chrome on Android, which is already supported, this is an alternative to running Chrome driver on your own separately, or running Selenium on your own separately. So it just kind of brings everything now into the Appium ecosystem, because Appium already had a Safari driver, things like that. So that's some of the new drivers that exist. Hopefully folks will be working on more that I don't even know about yet. An example of some plugins. There were some features that were formerly part of Appium itself that we decided were better off as plugins, and so we removed them from Appium. So now if you want to continue using those features, you need to install and activate these plugins. So the images plugin I already talked about. Execute driver script is a pretty cool feature that allows you to batch up WebDriver commands and have them all executed on the server, so you don't have to pay the cost of latency back and forth for each command, which is especially useful if you're running commands against WebDriver or Appium servers that are far away from wherever you're running those commands. There's a plugin that lets you automate Unity games that kind of sits on top of the Alt Unity Tester project, which is very useful. project from a company called Altum. The device farm plugin I mentioned before. There's an OCR plugin that I wrote that works similarly to the images plugin, except instead of finding screen regions based on what they look like as an image, lets you find screen regions based on the text that they contain, even if that text isn't searchable in the UI tree, even if you wouldn't be able to find that element otherwise. It's kind of cool. Only really useful if you're dealing with, I don't know, maybe you're dealing with a PDF application or something like that and want to know where certain text is on the screen. But it's a cool example of the sort of thing you can do with the plugin. So recommend checking all these out. And of course, we have our new documentation, which I've already sort of spoken about. But I think it's useful to talk about, as an Appium user, where to go when you have different types of questions. So if you want to learn about Appium as a whole, if you want to get an overview of Appium, learn how to install Appium, learn about what drivers are, learn about what capabilities are, things like that, you go to the Appium docs at appium.io. If you want to, get a reference for server command line arguments, like what are, how do you change the port that Appium runs on? Or how do you update a plugin or something like that? That's also the main Appium docs. If you want to see what drivers and plugins are available, we have a list of them at the Appium docs. And on the other hand, if you want to do something that's related to a specific platform or a specific plugin, you want to go to the documentation for that specific driver or that specific plugin. So if you want to figure out how to install or use the XCUI test driver, you don't go to appium.io. You go to the XCUI test documentation, which we have linked from appium.io also for convenience. If you want to see what commands are available in a particular platform, say like, oh, can I run the install app command on this driver? Well, you go to the documentation for that driver and look in its command reference. If you want to see what capabilities are available, how do I make it so that this session, what's an example capability off the top of my head, that on Android that only, or that all UI elements are included in the source tree and not just elements that the accessibility layer considers significant. The documentation for that capability is going to be at the UI Automator 2 documentation site, not at appium.io anymore, because appium.io doesn't really know about all the different drivers that do or might exist. So that's the kind of delineation of responsibilities that, as a user, I think it's helpful to understand. So I've already shown you a little bit of the Appium documentation. Oops, I think my keyboard might have lost its battery. I want to give you a tour of the documentation. Hold on a second. No, it's just that my keyboard isn't working. That's strange. Okay, let's try this. There we go. So here's our Appium documentation. Introduction to Appium. This is all very good reading. If you're a little bit shaky on, what Appium is, how it works, things like that, there's an introduction that gives you some specific examples of how to write your first test in a variety of languages. You've got your command line reference. These are all what I was mentioning before. Different flags and options you can use when starting the Appium server, things like that. And a bunch of just helpful guides, right? Like you encounter a command called set context or something in your client, or what is that? You can come to the Appium documentation, read about what the context API is and what it's about, things like that. If you want to build Appium extensions, we have documentation on how to build Appium drivers, which are pretty comprehensive. Tell you basically everything you need to know. as I mentioned before, though, let's say we had some questions about the XUI test driver. We would go to the XUI test driver documentation, which now has its own site. You can see that the style is very similar to the main Appium documentation, but it's got all the content that is appropriate for this driver. And you can see you can pick which particular version you might be using. Look at things like setup and requirements. There's even some helpful reference material here. So there's a command reference that talks about all the commands that are available with this particular driver, including all the mobile commands, or what we call execute methods. So, we've got this command mobile clear keychains that clears keychains on a simulator. And this is where you go to see all the things that are available for the XUI test driver. So that's a little tour of our documentation. We're pretty proud of this new doc system and hope that you find it useful. And obviously, if you notice anything that is incorrect, it should now hopefully be easier to submit, to find where to make a pull request to submit a fix, because all of the documentation for the XUI test driver is in the XUI test driver repo, and so on. So it's pretty straightforward to help us out if you notice any issues with the docs as well. So let's close by talking about Appium 2 on HeadSpin. So if you're not familiar with HeadSpin, HeadSpin is an Appium cloud. It's a whole lot more than that. There's all kinds of amazing features that, the purpose of this talk isn't for me to sell you on HeadSpin, but it is a really great place to run your Appium tests on, real devices or real TVs or whatever kind of platform you want to run Appium tests on. I'm pretty proud of HeadSpin's adoption of the Appium 2 vision of automation for every platform. So we support a whole load of platforms for automation, which I think is pretty amazing. And Appium 2 obviously supports HeadSpin supports Appium 2 from day one, and has supported Appium 2 from before, from the beta period as well. So it's totally possible as a HeadSpin customer to just switch right over to Appium 2 with minimal changes to your own code, fewer changes even than when running locally. Just a few things to be aware of as a HeadSpin user. If you want to opt into Appium 2 at this point, you want to use the HeadSpin Appium version capability. And this is also required with local Appium now, but you obviously need to use the automation name capability to let HeadSpin know what sort of platform you want to automate. This isn't different from local Appium in any case. If you want to use plugins in your HeadSpin test, it's a little bit different than using plugins locally. Locally, you have to start the Appium server opting into activating certain plugins, but as a HeadSpin user, you don't run the Appium server. We run it for you. So to let us know what plugins you want to be active during your session, just use the Appium plugins capability. There are also HeadSpin specific migration docs at this URL. I can show you what they look like here. It's pretty short. There's really not a whole lot you need to do beyond what I've just demonstrated on the slide here, but that is in our documentation as well. So feel free to check that out. And I think that is pretty much all that I had to share about Appium 2. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would just check the time. Yeah, we've got plenty of time for some Q&A. So I'm pretty sure the way it works is you put any questions you have into the Q&A panel or widget in your Zoom software, and then I'll look at them and respond to the ones that I see. All right, so let's have a look over here. How are plugins different from drivers? From Sridhar. So I think you might have asked this question earlier on in the presentation. Maybe it's a moot point, but if I could just try and sum up an answer to this question, it'd be that a driver is an Appium extension that makes it possible to automate a certain platform, right? It makes it possible to do any automation at all on a certain type of app platform, like iOS or Android, or a TV platform of some kind or whatever. A plugin has much broader possibilities of what it can do, but it's not designed to automate a platform. It's designed to change the way that Appium works, potentially for all platforms. So one little, well, I guess you could take the OCR plugin that I talked about that looks for regions on the screen that have certain text that you specify. Doesn't care what platform you're doing that on. You could be doing that on iOS or Android or a TV platform or a web browser. That plugin will still work. So its responsibility cuts across the responsibility of a driver. So if you think of drivers going like this, and plugins kind of go like that. May not be very helpful, but yeah, so plugins are very different from drivers in that way. Okay. Can we get the PowerPoint? I don't know how to send things to people, but I'll certainly make it available to the folks responsible for running this webinar. And I don't know if they may choose just to make the video available or a PDF or something. So I guess I don't really know, but I'll certainly make it available and leave it up to the folks running the webinar as to how to share the webinar content. Thanks, Prashant. Hi, Nick Heat. How is Chromium driver different from the Selenium Chrome driver? Yes, it's a good question. So there's a piece of software called Chrome driver, which actually isn't all that connected with the Selenium project anymore. It's maintained by Google, and it is a WebDriver implementation for Chrome, really for any kind of Chromium-based browser. But if you want to use it, you have to run it as a separate program on your computer. And you have to set up your Selenium client to talk to that Chrome driver instance that you're running. Or if you might have a Selenium client that runs Chrome driver under the hood for you. Some of them will do that. But previously it wasn't possible to do that from Appium. So if you had just an Appium set up for automating iOS or Android, you didn't have Chrome driver installed separately, you didn't want to manage it separately. Now you can just say Appium driver install Chromium and happily start automating Chromium. You don't have to download Chrome driver on your own, and you don't have to run it on your own. The Appium driver will do that for you. The other advantage of Appium drivers, more, I guess, over just the vanilla Chrome driver or Gecko driver or Safari driver, is that you can do things like use plugins with them, right? Like I just mentioned, you could use the Appium OCR plugin on a web browser using the Appium Chromium driver, when that wouldn't be possible if you were just sending your test automation commands to an instance of Chrome driver that you're running on your own. So even for driver software that exists independently of Appium, there is a benefit to kind of converting those into Appium drivers to take advantage of all the other things that are available in the Appium ecosystem. Okay, Sridhar again asks, are there any plugins to interact with the native camera? Let me think about that. No, I don't think, no. Well, I know the answer is no. I'm trying to think about whether it's even possible. Doing stuff with cameras is pretty tricky. There are often limitations around that. Typically what we recommend with Appium is that if you want to interact with the native camera, you do it in the way that a user would. So, tap the camera button or whatever. I'm not sure what sort of camera features you have in mind that you would want a plugin to address, but maybe those are possible to create as a plugin. I'm not sure, but there aren't any camera specific plugins that have been developed now, as far as I know. Okay, so got a question from Sudhir. Will Appium 2 reduce the mobile and web app testing time? And if so, how would it, something about better live streaming, reduce latency? How can Appium address issues in terms of performance testing of apps irrespective of any geographical location? I'm not sure I totally understand the question. It feels to me like it's talking about something which is kind of outside the scope of what Appium is responsible for. So Appium is responsible for giving you the ability to automate, behaviors in apps. And it is based on a client server architecture, so you can run those automation commands from halfway across the world if you want. But how those apps perform, how those apps interact with other apps that or other devices that might be near or far to them, Appium doesn't really want to give you tools to address those kinds of situations. There is some ability within certain Appium drivers to gain performance data from applications, which might even include network data that you could use to do performance testing with Appium. Pretty rudimentary. I think that's one of the selling points of the HeadSpin platform, is that we have all these kind of performance and network analysis tools designed to kind of surface usability issues of the kind that you're talking about. So I would say, to sum up my answer, I don't think that Appium is trying to address those issues, but I think that there are tools out there that are trying to give you insight about network performance and things like that. And then you can use Appium to drive the automated tests that generate that data that you can get an analysis for from HeadSpin or whatever. Okay. We have another one from, here's a new one from Mandeep. Explain the device farm plugin. I don't know it in detail. I do know it's been out there for a while. I think what it is something that lets you combine devices you have locally and kind of run tests on them, and then see test results in kind of a website that's hosted locally. Presumably you could host it also in your company intranet or something like that. I'm afraid I'm probably not the best one to explain the details of that plugin. I wasn't really involved in developing it, but I do know that people are using it, and it's built by some great Appium maintainers. So yeah, definitely worth checking out. From Sridhar, I often see stale element exceptions. Is Appium 2 better in this? Yeah, Appium 2 is a totally different concept topic than whatever the cause of stale element exceptions are. Maybe it would help to talk about why stale element exceptions happen. So you have your application, and it has all these UI elements in it. And when you find an element to interact with, that's one WebDriver command. So your client says to the Appium server, find me an element with these characteristics. And the Appium server passes that command off to the platform-specific driver. A driver finds that element, and the driver can't push that element across the internet to your test script. Like, it just exists in the app on the phone or whatever, right? Like it can't go over the wire. The element stays here. So what the driver does is it maintains a reference to that element, and it just gives it a special ID, and it passes that ID back to your test script. And then when your test script tries to click on something or send keystrokes to something, all it's doing is saying, hey, click on the element with this ID. And that ID is sent back as text to the driver. And the driver says, okay, what element does this correspond to? What element is this referring to? And then it uses the native methods that are available to it, like within XUI test or UI Automator 2 or whatever, to actually click on that element. But problems can happen. For example, let's say you find the element, the reference is sent back to your client, you do some things over here in your test script, and then you say, I want to click on this element. So you send the click command back to the Appium server, goes to the driver, and the driver says, okay, I want to click element with the ID of, foo or whatever. And it goes to click on that element, and the element isn't there anymore. So what can the driver do in that case? It can't click on it. And anything else that it could try to do would be potentially confusing. It'd lead to potentially undefined behavior. So instead of doing anything, it just lets you know that something went wrong. And that's what a stale element exception is. It says this element that you have a reference to, it doesn't actually exist in the UI anymore. Now, what can be tricky is when we as human beings are looking at the screen and we say, but the element does exist, it's still there. Well, maybe to a human it still exists, but for some reason, the application or the operating system has decided that this is now a different element. So there's really not much we can do about that as driver developers, because if the operating system is telling us that the element is no longer there, what else could we do? So there are some tools that are built on top of Appium and Selenium that can try and recover from these situations. In some test frameworks, I've seen situations where there's a retry associated with interacting with an element, where if a click fails because of a stale element exception, the element is refound and then clicked again, and hopefully it works that time. Typically, you only see this in situations where there's something unique going on in the app, and it could be down to an application development issue where they may be refreshing elements under the hood in a way which doesn't really work well with automation. So that's the way stale element exceptions work, and why there's not much we can do about it, and why it's best to handle them at a higher level than Appium. So you can handle that in your test framework to try and have a more graceful outcome of those situations. Okay, good question. I see we just have a few more minutes, and I think we're pretty much done with Q&A here. So any last question you want to drop in, feel free to. I'll give another minute. Meanwhile, I'll just say again, thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you for using Appium. I am always just surprised and blown away at the fact that people use Appium and find it helpful. I know many of us, including myself, are frustrated with it from time to time as well. But I'm thrilled that this tool exists, and that I've been able to be a part of the team that's developed it over the last decade plus now. And yeah, please let us know on the Appium issue tracker if you find any issues with Appium 2. And I hope some of you at least are inspired to go and build an Appium driver for a platform that you care about, or build an Appium plugin based on some ideas you have about how to make Appium better. And so the documentation for all that is there. And yeah, thanks for celebrating the release of Appium 2 with me, with us at HeadSpin. And hope you have a great rest of your day, morning, afternoon, night, whatever it is where you are. Thanks, and happy testing as always.